Matthew Coller, Courtney Cronin joining us now from Pro Football Focus. He has draft simmed in preparation for this with Pro Football Focus's new draft simulator. George Shahuri. George, how do you feel about your draft?
I feel very strong. I only had to do like 15 to get there, and I was trying to get one that I really love. And look, that's the great thing about the draft is it's in its nature a kind of random set of events where one move triggers another move triggers another. So by the time it gets to 22, so many crazy things can happen, and that's what makes it so fun and exciting. But I am personally very happy with how I drafted for the Vikings.
Okay, so you've taken Christian Fulton, the corner from LSU, and then Jalen Reagor, the TCU receiver, and Michael Pittman, the receiver from USC. Now, you are going a direction that we have talked about quite a bit here, but a little more aggressively. I have been team multi-receiver draft because if you put all your eggs in one basket and the guy gets there and turns out that he doesn't know how to run routes, it's happened recently, then you're just in trouble. And, you look at all the second and third round receivers who have turned out to be good in the last few years. George, I think it would be smart for somewhere in the first 3 rounds, the Vikings to take 2 wide receivers.
Yeah, and the cool thing about this one is, Michael Pittman Jr., who's the guy that I took at 58, he could easily go, he could be a first rounder, top of the second guy. You just never know, but there will be a guy that slips. I think about Tyler Johnson too, from Minnesota, just down the street there, who, that doesn't have the athleticism that people are craving, right? So maybe he slips a little bit, but is a really shifty route runner, can get open. You need a third receiver in today's NFL. Like, I think it is laughable to be of the mindset that you bring in 2 receivers and you're good to go. You need 3 guys that can create separation and get open. So to me, it's a logical move to go multi-receiver.
Now, since you used one of your first-round picks in this at 25, you stood pat and you got Jalen Reagor and you also got Michael Pittman Jr. At any point, because I was playing around with a new simulator yesterday and playing around with some trades and all the options that were available, did you consider trading back from 25? Because Matthew and I have had this discussion before about potentially getting more bang for your buck at a second or a third round pick from that number 25 spot and being able to still get a very quality receiver, maybe somewhere in that day 2 range that you could also couple with getting at 58 as well. So you'd maybe have a receiver pick at 58 and then again in the third round. Did that cross your mind at all to do that?
I thought of 2 things. I thought of trading back, and I also did a couple where I traded up, just to see. It's suboptimal to trade up if you're not trading to get a quarterback, basically. But the trade down is interesting because it requires someone on the other end wanting to trade up. And I mentioned the quarterback position. That's usually how you get assets in return, because a team is saying, look, I want to take this quarterback, and because the quarterback has such a potentially high return on investment, I'm going to maybe overpay a little bit, right? And that's how you can accumulate those extra picks. So if a guy like Jordan Love falls, or Justin Herbert falls to 25, and there's a team that decides, you know what, we want this guy, that could open up a spot where you can trade back from 25. We saw Michael Pittman here. I mentioned Tyler Johnson. There's so many good receivers that if you are waiting till the later into the second round, third round, you're still going to get some good players. And what you really want to do is flip the coin as many times as you can, right? Accumulate more draft picks so that you have more chances to get players that are very good, right? Stephon Diggs was a 5th round pick. Those things happen, but you have to be able to flip coins to find them.
George, in my mentions already, you're getting a little bit flamed for not drafting an offensive lineman, which I think that you have to understand the PTSD for offensive line recently by the Vikings. You guys at PFF ranked them 27th, I think, last year in pass blocking and maybe 28th the year before. So even as much as criticism as we've given Kirk Cousins, and it's deserved, he has not had good pass protection since he's been here. And some of it is his doing, but it hasn't been good. What do we know about offensive linemen in the draft? Like, is there something that you can give us some insight on in terms of a study that you guys have done or whatever? Because if I think that is something that does have to be a consideration here. They've tried to go the route of, well, we'll fill it in free agency, or we'll fill it with this 5th round draft pick or this 3rd round draft pick. And then last year they draft in the 1st round and still don't get a guy that could step right in and make an immediate impact. So what do we know that could help the Vikings in this draft to get a good offensive lineman that can make an impact?
Yeah, here's what I keep talking about, which is, what is your drop-off in terms of, say I take a guy in the 1st round or the 2nd round versus then taking that same position in, say, the 4th through 7th. And actually, the guy that did the bulk of the work on our mock draft sim, Timo Riske at PFF_Moo, one of the better follows out there.
He is.
He wrote a fantastic article where he compared the drop-off between positions and facets too. And guard is just a more easily replaceable position. So I'm not saying ignore it. In fact, if Michael Pittman Jr. hadn't been there, I might have thought about a guy like Netane Muti, who is probably the only guard that I would really think about, taking somewhat early. And there's some tackles that we really like who performed really well, who you might be able to get for kind of a bargain because the run on tackles and the tackle class is so deep and that run happens earlier. Got like maybe an Ezra Cleveland if he slips a little bit. So I don't think it's something that you ignore, but what we have learned is that you want to take shots earlier on the players and positions that have a bigger drop-off. And that is just far larger for corners and receivers and quarterbacks than it is for guards and tackles and D linemen and linebackers.
Well, that being said, they have 2 of those positions that are major needs for them that they've got to fill right away with cornerback and receiver. So if you think about the big picture here in the 4 positions total that I would say are in your top tier of priorities, those 2 that I just mentioned, defensive end and offensive tackle, to think that they're going to get 4 of those players with all of their 5 picks that they have in the top 105 seems a little bit of a stretch because we know how things work out. Of those 4, which do you think that they miss out on, if any?
Man, well, it's interesting. I have a feeling that the ones that I think they will miss out on will be, the NFL will kind of do the opposite. And so, I think that if I were drafting all of the picks, wide receiver would be the ones that would go off the board more quickly. But I think the NFL is still in a place where they do prioritize, the positions closer to, the ball and the line of scrimmage a little more highly. And so I think that those will actually, start to come off the board earlier than I anticipate. And depending on what the Vikings want to do, if they do decide to go wide receiver, cornerback early, they could find themselves missing out on the guy that they wanted at those other positions. But in my mind, that's a worthwhile gamble to take because you just can't find great wide receivers and great cornerbacks everywhere. You can fill in average positions, on the offensive line and the defensive line at a much lower price through free agency and, later in the draft. And so to me, that's the one you take the risk on missing out on.
Talking with George Shahuri, the PFF forecast, one of my favorites while jogging, though I have been splitting my time with the 2-for-1 PFF podcast to get more informed on the draft as well. Now, you and Eric Eager have done analytics mock drafts. And of course, when they get put out there, people are upset. And George, I want to know the biggest difference between what you find in your analytics mock draft, where you focus very heavily on positional value and what the numbers behind a player say about their probability of success, versus what the traditional mocks and the scouting and the combine results and things like that, like what they say versus what you've done with your data to make those decisions.
Yeah, well, the biggest difference in just looking at our mock draft and the responses we get is people not reading the introduction, which says, "Hey, this is not a prediction of what we think will happen. It's what we would do," because people go, "Oh, there's no way that this team that I follow dearly will ever take this player." It's like, yeah, I get it, bro. I understand. I'm trying to tell you what I think they should do. I'm trying to be forward thinking instead of looking at the past. But here's, I think, the big misnomer, which is that positional value really matters. And if you are going to draft for need, you are wasting a valuable currency. You can fill needs in other places through free agency, right? You can find guys that are you get a decent bargain on that can fill those needs. In the draft, it's your shot to get transcendent players at positions that matter. You don't find that in free agency because when teams find those players, they don't hit the market. So you have to take shots on players that can make a substantial difference at quarterback, at wide receiver, at corner, and that's how you end up competing for a Super Bowl. You can't be taking defensive interior linemen early in the draft and hoping that that all of a sudden you're going to go to the Super Bowl. That Aaron Donald's the best interior defensive lineman we've maybe ever seen, and the Rams were utterly worthless until they got a passing game. So to me, that's the biggest difference between where we're at projecting players forward and where the league is at. And honestly, it means that there's a lot of value to be had for some teams that are out there that will think a little bit more forward.
So Matthew and I get a lot of draft sims, and I'm sure people are going to start using the PFF
So
model.
many, and we love you all.
And we get them. People say, "Hey, can you grade this?" And I'm actually looking over one of them right now that has Jerry Jeudy at 22, and some of these surprise me just how the board falls. And I know that a lot of this is random, and yes, we're talking about a computer simulation here, but if there was one move that you could maybe project out to next Thursday, something in the first round that really wouldn't surprise you if somebody that we're expecting is going top 10, a Jeff Okudah, a Mekhi Becton, that would possibly fall out into the 20s, who might that be?
Wow, that is a really good question. Well, I should say that one of the things that you can tune about our mock draft is how random it is.
You can say you want very random. I did that yesterday, and I was all over the place.
I mean, that's the cool thing, and it feels wonky at first, but then you go look at some of the drafts in the past, and you go, this stuff kind of happens. To me, the position that I think could potentially fall is receiver, and it's that 10, 11, 12, 13 range where teams should clearly take receivers, but they might say to themselves, you know what, I'm gonna let them slide because it's so deep. The class is so deep, and I don't want to take a shot early. And then all of a sudden, one of those big three guys does fall. Now, if they fall at 22, I would be a little surprised. But falling past 15, I could see one of those top three receivers maybe squeaking out because the team is hesitant with such a deep draft class. And like I said before, they overdraft a position that's less valuable. I think tackles will still get drafted pretty highly just because of what we've seen in the past. That seems to kind of be what the NFL likes to do. So if I'm betting on one, it'd be receiver. Maybe it'll be Jerry Jeudy. Who knows?
Well, yeah, I felt the same way when there's so many receivers that there's likely to have one that people like more than the other guys that we expect to be drafted high. And by the time you get to 22, this is the one positive for the Vikings, George, when you were talking about, hey, don't draft for need. Well, with the Vikings, they're all needs. So it's sort of like that GIF with the guy pointing at his head like, well, that's how you beat the system is you need every position. I want to know what you think about Tua because, there's some people who are higher on him than others. And let's just say really high in terms of Trent Dilfer, who said that he has a better arm than Dan Marino today. That might be, that's definitely some kind of high. But what do we think about a guy who plays for a really great program and puts up massive numbers? The injuries, you can't know, I can't know how those are going to work out. But is still not considered the number one guy because Burrow, who's sort of a one-year wonder, has an incredible 1 year on an amazing team with a great offense. Like, how do we deal with these outside factors with quarterbacks? Because I think that's one of the reasons that we all get it wrong so often with that position.
It's a very interesting question. One of the things that we do is when we project players forward, we take into account who they've played and who they've played with. Mm-hmm. And while those things matter, Joe Burrow played as hard of a set of defenses as you can find. And yes, that matters. But he was in an environment that allowed him to succeed. The same thing is true in the NFL. Like, how many quarterbacks do you feel confident if you put them in a crappy system are going to succeed? Maybe two?
Yeah,
and still many. You're like, like Russell Wilson, Patrick Mahomes, you throw them in a bad system, and it's like, okay, fight for yourself. Like, I'm sure they do okay, but it's probably not, the type of seasons that we've seen from Mahomes and Andy Reid's system. So to a certain extent, all quarterbacks are, a product of having a good scheme, and you want to see them succeed and make good throws in that scheme. And so for Joe Burrow, he was so fantastic, but he made accurate throws when they needed to be made. And you sign an offensive coordinator and a head coach to get those guys open, and then you expect them to deliver. And Tua can do the same thing. And the tough thing with Tua is that you have kind of these two seasons where, he kind of faltered in places where you go, I'd really like my number one pick to have been great in that game. And Joe Burrow was great in all of those games. So to me, that's the difference. But I don't think it's that massive where people should be going, oh, should Tua fall to 6? Should he be the third quarterback taken? Like, that's ridiculous. The idea that you would take Justin Herbert over Tua Tagovailoa is like, I'm trying to think of an analogy where someone just overthinks something so massively. Like, I can't, to be perfectly honest with you, because that to me would just be absolutely ridiculous. It'd be similar to, like, Ryan Leaf over Peyton Manning. Remember when we had that conversation?
Yeah. I was thinking Blake Bortles over, even though Teddy Bridgewater had the injury, but Bridgewater had been for a long time projected as the top pick, and then somehow Blake Bortles takes it. And you're like, excuse me? I'm like, who is Blake Bortles? Right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that would be a sort of a classic. Well, Teddy didn't have a good pro day and he didn't use his gloves. You're like, does any of this matter?